The Viking Siege of Paris, how a river ambush nearly changed European history. Imagine you are standing on the Isle de la Cité, the small, teardrop-shaped island at the heart of what will one day become one of the most celebrated cities in the world. It is November 25th, in the year 885 AD. The air is iron cold, the kind of cold that comes off a river in late autumn and gets into the bones and stays there. The Seine rolls black and heavy around you, its current indifferent to what is about to unfold. Frost has crystallized along the reed beds of the bank. Your breath fogs in front of your face. Around you, on the walls and in the towers, and along the bridge parapets, other men stand and watch the water, and then, emerging from the morning mist like ghosts made solid, you see them. Ships. More ships than you have ever seen in one place. More ships than you thought could fit on one river. 700 ships, some accounts say. Carved prows shaped like serpents and dragons splitting the grey water, their figureheads snarling at the sky. Shields lined along the gunwales in rows of red, black, and painted wood, each one representing a warrior, each warrior representing death. The creak of rigging, the deep rhythmic grunt of oars, the voices of thousands of men in a language that sounds like thunder spoken by mountains. And standing at the oars at the masts, cramming every plank of every vessel, an estimated 30,000 Norse warriors, Vikings, and they have come for Paris now. Before we go any further, I want you to stop and really let those numbers sink in. 30,000 men on 700 ships. The population of the entire city of Paris at this moment in history is probably somewhere between 5 and 10,000 people, including women, children, the elderly, the sick, the clergy. The trained soldiers available to defend the walls, the bridges, and the towers number fewer than 200. 200 men against 30,000. The ratio is not a military problem, it is a mathematical impossibility. It is the kind of disparity that, in the calculus of medieval warfare, admits of exactly one conclusion: Paris should have fallen that morning. By every rule of siege warfare, by every precedent of Norse raiding in the Frankish kingdom, by every rational calculation available to any observer standing on those walls, Paris should have been taken within days, stripped of its treasures, and left in smoking ruins by the time December arrived. The treasure of the Frankish kingdom should have been divided among Norse chieftains by firelight on the north bank. The survivors should have been enslaved or ransomed, and the course of European civilization should have bent, irrevocably, toward a different future. It didn't happen. The city held, and the story of why it held, the story of the human choices, the extraordinary courage, the devastating failures, and the world-altering consequences that radiate outward from 11 months on the Seine, is one of the most compelling episodes in all of medieval history. It is a story that involves a bishop who fought like a warlord and died like a penitent, a count who broke through enemy lines on horseback weeping and came back a king, a Viking chieftain who was possibly more diplomat than destroyer, a Carolingian emperor who had every resource to save his people and chose, in the end, to buy his way out of responsibility, and 12 anonymous soldiers who held a ruined tower against thousands until every last one of them was dead. Welcome to boring history lovers. I'm glad you're here. Tonight we are going deep, deeper than the summaries, deeper than the textbook paragraphs, deeper than the tourist board version. We are going to live inside this siege. We are going to smell the pitch and the river mud. We are going to stand in the towers and feel the weight of what those defenders carried through 11 months of cold and fear and hunger. We are going to understand not just what happened on the Seine in 885 and 886, but why it happened, who made it happen, what it cost, and what it means that it happened at all, because the Siege of Paris is not simply a military story, though the military story is extraordinary enough. It is a story about the collapse of an empire, the greatest empire Western Europe had seen since Rome, and what fills the vacuum when an empire falls. It is a story about the nature of political legitimacy. What makes a man a king, and what happens when a king fails his people. It is a story about the relationship between the Norse world and the Frankish world, a relationship far more complex and mutual than the simple predator-prey model that popular history tends to impose on it. And it is a story about the birth of France, the actual France, the kingdom that would go on to shape Western civilization for the next 1,000 years, which was born not in a palace or a cathedral, but on a bridge, in a siege, in the defiance of a dying bishop so settled in. This is going to take a while, and it is worth every single minute to understand the Viking Siege of Paris. You have to understand the world the Vikings were sailing into. And that world, in 885 AD, was a world in the process of coming apart at the seams, slowly, loudly, with all the institutional groaning and political recrimination of a great structure that everyone can see failing, and no one can agree on how to save. Rewind 60 years. In the early 9th century, the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Karl der Grosse, Carolus Magnus, was the dominant political force in Western Europe, and by the estimation of its own chroniclers, the dominant political force in the known world. Charlemagne had united what is today France, Germany, the Low Countries, Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy, and large parts of Central Europe under a single crown. He had been crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 AD, in a ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome that announced to the world, emphatically, theatrically, with all the symbolic weight that the Roman imperial legacy could carry, that something new and powerful had risen from the ruins of the old Roman order in the West. The Carolingian Empire was enormous. It was administratively sophisticated for its time, with a system of royal agents called missi dominici who traveled the empire to enforce the king's will, with a standardized coinage, with a reformed church that reached into every community, and with a military capability that had repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to conquer, convert, and absorb neighboring peoples. It was also, in retrospect, structurally fragile in ways that Charlemagne himself may not have fully appreciated. The empire's administrative coherence depended enormously on the personal authority of the emperor. The missi dominici worked because local lords feared and respected Charlemagne. The military campaigns succeeded because Charlemagne was a genuinely talented commander who led from the front. The church reform worked because Charlemagne backed it with imperial force. Remove Charlemagne from the equation, and the question of what remained, what institutional infrastructure could survive the loss of that singular personal authority, was one the empire had not really answered. Charlemagne died in 814 after a reign of over 4 decades. He was 72 years old, which in the 9th century was a remarkable age, and he had been conscious enough of the succession problem to have his son Louis crowned co-emperor in 813, a year before his death. Louis the Pious. The Pious is another contemporary nickname, not a retrospective judgment, inherited the throne, and for the first decade of his reign managed reasonably well. He was not his father. He lacked Charlemagne's physical presence, his military genius, his capacity for ruthless decision. But he was intelligent, genuinely devout, administratively competent, and surrounded by able advisors. The empire under Louis held. Then Louis made 2 decisions that between them doomed the Carolingian imperial project. First, he had an ordinatio imperii, an imperial ordinance, issued in 817, which was meant to regularize the succession by giving the eldest son, Lothair, the imperial title and making his younger brothers sub-kings subordinate to him. This seemed tidy on paper. In practice, it created a clear hierarchy of sons that the younger brothers deeply resented. Second, after the death of his first wife, Louis married a woman named Judith of Bavaria in 819, and in 823 Judith bore him a fourth son, Charles, the future Charles the Bald. Louis, as fathers do, loved this unexpected late child. He tried to carve out a share of the empire for Charles. His three older sons, understandably, regarded this as a violation of the 817 agreement. The result was civil war, not one civil war, but a rolling series of conflicts through the 830s that pitted Louis against his sons, the sons against each other, and various factions of the Frankish aristocracy against everyone. Louis was even, at one extraordinary moment in 833, publicly humiliated and forced to perform penance at a ceremony orchestrated by his own rebellious sons. He recovered. He kept the throne until his death in 840. But the credibility of Carolingian imperial unity died with that humiliation after Louis's death. The civil war continued between the surviving brothers, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, until exhaustion and attrition brought them to the negotiating table. In 843, at Verdun, they signed the treaty that partitioned the empire. Lothair got the middle strip, from the Low Countries through Burgundy and Provence into Italy, and kept the imperial title. Louis the German got the eastern territories, east of the Rhine, essentially. Charles the Bald got the western territories, essentially modern France. Three pieces, each nominally a kingdom, each in practice a collection of competing regional powers barely held together by royal authority that was visibly weaker than it had been a generation before. The administrative consequences of this division were severe and immediate. The coordinated frontier defense that had characterized Charlemagne's empire, the watch posts, the response forces, the naval patrols stopped functioning as a system. Each sub-kingdom could only defend its own borders, and even that proved difficult as royal authority continued to fragment in competition with the ambitions of the great regional lords, who were increasingly powerful, increasingly autonomous, and increasingly inclined to regard the king's demands as suggestions rather than commands. The roads deteriorated, the coinage fragmented, the missi dominii became less effective, and at the coastlines and river mouths, the Norse, who had been watching the empire's political difficulties with the interest of experienced professionals, began to probe more aggressively. The first recorded Norse raid on the Frankish coastline dates to 799 in Charlemagne's time, a strike on the island of Noirmoutier off the Loire estuary that was contained and punished. Under Charlemagne, Norse raids were manageable. The emperor ordered coastal defenses constructed and a watch fleet deployed. He received Norse leaders at his court, sometimes as suppliants, sometimes as hostages, sometimes as allies in complex northern political games. The Norse were a problem, but they were a problem within the capacity of the empire to manage. After Verdun, the management failed. In 841, Norse raiders, we do not know who led them, sacked Rouen, the largest city in what is now Normandy. In 842, they occupied the mouth of the Seine and used it as a base. In 843, a Norse force sailed up the Loire and destroyed Nantes on the feast day of John the Baptist, killing the bishop at the altar while the church was full of worshippers who had come for the celebration and found instead the last thing they ever saw. In 845, the Danish chieftain Ragnar, who may or may not be the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, a question we will not resolve today and probably never will, sailed up the Seine with a fleet of 120 ships, defeated a Frankish force on the river, hanged 111 Frankish prisoners on an island in the Seine in full view of the Second Frankish army on the opposite bank, and proceeded to sack Paris. Charles the Bald paid him £7,000 of silver, roughly 3 tons, to go away. That payment in 845 established a template that would shape the next 40 years of Norse-Frankish relations. The Franks would pay, the Norse would go away, then the Norse would come back because the Franks would pay again. The payment had a Norse name, Danegeld, the Danes' gold. It was, in the most literal sense, a business model. Show up with enough force to be threatening, negotiate the ransom, collect the money, return next season. The risk-reward calculation was extraordinary. A fleet of ships and a few thousand warriors could extract more silver from a single raid on the Frankish kingdom than most of them could earn in a lifetime of farming or trading. Why stop? And so they didn't stop. Norse fleets returned to the Seine in 856, again in 861, 865, 876, and 877. They established a permanent base on the island of Noirmoutier and used it as a year-round operating post. The first Norse settlement in Francia, a winter camp that gradually accumulated the character of a community. They raided deep into the interior, up the Loire and the Garonne as well as the Seine. They sacked Chartres. They burned the suburbs of Paris so often that the burning of the Paris suburbs became almost routine in the Frankish annals, a seasonal occurrence like the harvest. They raided so far up the Loire that they reached Tours, the most sacred city in Frankish Christianity, where the body of Saint Martin was kept, and they stripped it bare. They were, by the 870s, not simply raiders passing through. They were a persistent, structural feature of the Frankish political landscape. The cumulative cost of all this raiding, in silver, in destroyed infrastructure, in disrupted trade, in burned monasteries and depopulated countryside, was staggering. The economic drain on the kingdom was severe, but the psychological and political damage may have been even worse. The Norse raids exposed, over and over and over again, the fundamental incapacity of the Carolingian political system to protect its own people. Each raid that went unanswered, each ransom paid, each burned monastery rebuilt at enormous cost, while the king's court debated what to do. Each of these events chipped away at the legitimacy of the Carolingian claim to rule. Kings, in the medieval understanding, existed to provide justice and protection. Kings who couldn't protect their people were failing at the primary purpose of their existence. The Norse raids were not just a military problem. They were a legitimacy crisis. By 885, the cumulative Danegeld payments made by various Frankish rulers over the preceding 4 decades has been estimated by historians at somewhere between £40,000 and £50,000 of silver. To give you some sense of what that means in practical terms, it represents an enormous proportion of the silver coinage in circulation in the Frankish economy, extracted and shipped north to Scandinavia over the course of a generation. The economic contraction this caused was real and measurable in the archaeological record. Mint output declined, trade routes contracted. The sophisticated commercial economy of the Carolingian heartland withered. This is the world into which our story opens in 885. A Frankish kingdom that is exhausted, fragmented, traumatized, economically strained, and led, at this particular moment in history, by a king who is, by almost every assessment available to us, catastrophically inadequate to the crisis he is about to face. His name is Charles III. History calls him Charles the Fat. It is not a flattering sobriquet, and it was not intended to be before we placed the Viking fleet on the Seine, we need to spend real time with the people on those ships. Because the word Viking has been so thoroughly colonized by popular culture, horned helmets that never existed, Hollywood berserkers drooling with bloodlust, Norse gods rendered as spandex-wearing superheroes, that the actual historical Norse tend to dissolve into cartoon. And the people who showed up outside Paris in November 885 were emphatically not cartoon figures. They were sophisticated, literate in their own tradition, politically complex, economically motivated, and operating according to a coherent strategic logic that we need to understand if we want to understand why the siege happened and how it unfolded. The word Viking itself deserves a moment of attention. In Old Norse, Vikinga refers to the act of raiding. To go Viking, fara I acute Viking, was to go on a raid or a sea expedition for profit. It was an activity, not an identity. The vast majority of people living in Scandinavia in the 9th century were not Vikings in this sense. They were farmers, pastoralists, fishermen, craftsmen, traders, poets, lawmen, and priests, or rather, Gothar, the Norse religious specialists who combined priestly functions with community leadership. The Norse world of the 9th century was not a society defined by raiding. It was a society in which raiding was one option, available primarily to young men with the right connections and the right equipment, pursued when the expected returns exceeded the costs and risks. To understand why raiding was such an attractive option for those young men, you need to understand something about Norse social structure. Norse society in this period was organized around a hierarchy of honor and obligation. At the top were the great chieftains and kings, men like the legendary Harald Harfagri, Harald Fairhair, who in the 870s and 880s was in the process of consolidating power over much of Norway. Below them were the landed freemen, the bondia, who owed military service and political loyalty to their local chieftains. Below them were the landless and the poor, who owed service without the security of land. And in Norse ideology, the path from the bottom to the top ran through reputation, through the accumulation of honor, fame, and wealth that demonstrated a man's worth in the eyes of his community, and his gods. Raiding abroad was, in this context, a rational career move for ambitious young Norse men who lacked the inherited wealth and land to establish themselves at home. A successful raid produced silver, which could be turned into arm rings and gifts to distribute to followers, the physical tokens of a chieftain's generosity and therefore his status. It produced slaves, a valuable commodity in both Norse and Frankish markets. It produced luxury goods, silks, glassware, relics, manuscripts, precious metalwork that couldn't be obtained any other way. And it produced reputation, the most valuable currency in the Norse world. A man who had sailed to France and come back with silver was a man worth following. A man worth following could attract followers. A man with followers could become a chieftain. The logic was self-reinforcing. The technology that made all of this possible was the longship. And I want to dwell on this for a moment, because the longship deserves its reputation as one of the great engineering achievements of the medieval world. The Norse had been developing their shipbuilding tradition for centuries through a process of constant iteration and refinement, driven by the demanding environment of the North Sea and the Norwegian coast. By the 9th century, they had arrived at a design of extraordinary sophistication. The longship was clinker-built, constructed from overlapping planks of split oak, each plank fastened to the next with iron rivets and sealed with tarred wool, which gave it a hull that was both strong and flexible, able to flex with the movement of rough water without cracking or breaking. It had a shallow draft, the distance from the waterline to the bottom of the hull, of less than a meter, which meant it could navigate rivers that deeper-hulled vessels could not enter. It could be beached directly on an open shore and relaunched quickly. It was propelled by a large square sail when the wind served and by oars when it didn't, meaning it was not dependent on weather in the way that purely sail-powered vessels were. And it was fast. A well-built 9th century longship could average 6 to 8 knots in good conditions, meaning the crossing from Denmark to the mouth of the Seine could be accomplished in under a week. This combination, shallow draft, speed, beachability, and the ability to navigate inland waterways, gave the Norse a strategic mobility that no Frankish military force could match. The Franks were fundamentally a land-based military power. Their armies moved on roads at the pace of horses and foot soldiers. They could not be everywhere at once. The Norse, moving by water, could strike at any point on any river network, almost without warning, and be gone before a Frankish response force could be assembled and marched to the location. The tactical challenge this posed to the Franks was genuinely novel, and it took them most of the 9th century to develop effective responses to it. The warriors on those ships were not the undisciplined berserkers of popular imagination, or rather, they were not only that. Elite Norse fighters were trained from childhood in the use of multiple weapons. The characteristic Norse weapon was the axe, specifically the broadaxe, the Dane axe, a weapon with a wide, flared blade on a long haft that could be used to hook an opponent's shield, to push through a shield wall, or simply to deliver a devastating chopping blow. They were also skilled swordsmen, spearmen, and archers, and the best fighters among them would have trained regularly, fought in multiple campaigns, and accumulated the kind of hard experience that distinguishes a professional soldier from an enthusiastic amateur. The tactical formation associated with Norse warfare is the Skjaldarborg, the shield wall, in which warriors stand shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, presenting a continuous defensive front while jabbing with spears or axes over and through the shield line. This is a disciplined, practiced formation that requires training and coordination to execute effectively. It is not the chaotic mob charge that Viking movies tend to depict. The Norse could and did fight in a chaotic mob charge when circumstances called for it. The berserkers, the Ulfheithnar, the warriors who went into battle in states of apparent frenzy, were real, though probably rarer than popular mythology suggests. But the primary tactical mode of a competent Norse force was disciplined, coordinated, and effective by the 880s. The Norse presence in the Frankish world had also acquired dimensions that were not purely military. Norse traders had established permanent presences in several Frankish ports. Norse leaders had been receiving land grants from Frankish kings in exchange for military service, essentially becoming Frankish lords, with all the feudal obligations and privileges that entailed for at least a generation. The Norse settlement of the Seine Valley, the eventual basis of Normandy, was already being prefigured in the 870s and 880s, as specific Norse leaders established semi-permanent bases in the lower Seine and began to interact with the local Frankish population in ways that went beyond simple raiding. The boundary between enemy and subject, between raider and settler, was already blurring. The leader of the fleet that arrives outside Paris in November 885 is named Siegfried, Siegfried in Old Norse sources, Sigfridus in Latin. We know tantalizingly little about him from outside the siege narrative itself, but what Abbo and the other Frankish sources tell us about his behavior during the siege suggests a man of considerable sophistication. He is patient. He is willing to negotiate. He keeps his enormous force functioning as a coherent military unit for nearly a year in difficult conditions. He knows what he wants, and what he wants, as we shall see, is not simply the destruction of Paris. What Siegfried wants is the river beyond Paris. He wants passage. He wants to take his 700 ships up the Seine into the rich interior of the Frankish kingdom, into Burgundy, into Champagne, into the fat monasteries and undefended market towns that lie beyond the city and its bridges. The bridges of Paris, the Grand Pont connecting the island to the north bank, the Petit Pont connecting it to the south, are the only fixed crossings on the Seine for a considerable distance. Any attempt to portage 700 ships around the bridges would be an enormous logistical undertaking, vulnerable to Frankish attack during the process and degrading to the vessels themselves. What Siegfried wants is for Paris to step aside. He will pay for that if he can get it that way. He will fight for it if he must. But his primary goal is not the sacking of Paris. It is the road beyond Paris. This is the key to understanding everything that follows. The Siege of Paris is, at its root, a siege about a road, about who controls the artery that runs through the city. And that means that almost every decision both sides make during the 11 months of the siege, every assault, every negotiation, every moment of tactical adjustment, needs to be understood in light of that fundamental objective. Paris, in 885, is not yet the city we know. It has no great Gothic cathedral. Notre Dame in its current form is a 12th century building that would not be begun for another 3 centuries. It has no boulevards, no grand bridges of stone, no left bank cafe culture. What it has is an island, a river, 2 wooden bridges fortified with stone towers, and a few thousand people who are about to find out whether they are capable of surviving one of the most dramatic sieges in medieval history. The Isle de la Cité, the city island, is the physical and political heart of the settlement. It is roughly oval, about 1 kilometer long from east to west, and perhaps 300 meters wide at its broadest point. In 885, it is densely built up with timber and stone structures. The royal palace on the western end, a cathedral dedicated to Saint Stephen on the eastern end, an earlier building on the site where Notre Dame will eventually rise, various churches, monasteries, the residences of the bishop and the senior clergy, workshops and houses for the civilian population, granaries and storage buildings. The island is surrounded by the Seine, which serves as a natural moat, a significant defensive advantage, but only as long as the bridges can be held, because the bridges are also the island's lifelines for resupply. The Grand Pont, the Great Bridge, connects the northern tip of the island to the north bank of the Seine, toward what is now the right bank, the commercial heart of later medieval Paris. The Petit Pont, the small bridge, connects the southern tip of the island to the south bank, toward what is now the left bank, where the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés stands, and where our chronicler Abbo will watch the siege unfold from a safe but terrifying vantage point. Both bridges are not simply wooden planking on pilings, they are fortified structures. Each has a tower at both ends. The island end tower is part of the island's defensive perimeter, and the bank end tower is a freestanding fortification that must be held independently if the bridge is to remain defensible. These bank end towers are in the architecture of the siege, the forward positions, the first line of defense, the positions that must hold if the bridges are to hold, the positions where the most intense fighting will occur. The military commander responsible for the defense of Paris is Odo, son of Robert the Strong. Let's spend a moment with both of those names, because understanding Odo requires understanding his father. Robert the Strong, Robertus Fortis, was one of the dominant military figures of the mid-9th century Frankish kingdom. He served as Marquis of Neustria, the great western region of the kingdom, and as such was responsible for defending the Loire Valley against Norse incursions. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily capable soldier and an effective administrator of the frontier. He fought the Norse repeatedly, and unlike most Frankish commanders of his era, sometimes won. In 866, at the Battle of Brissarth near Le Mans, he died fighting a Norse force, killed, Frankish sources say, when he lifted his helmet visor to see better during a pursuit, and was cut down at that unguarded moment. He died a hero of the Frankish aristocracy, and his sons inherited both his lands and his reputation. Odo, in 885, is in his early 30s, young for independent command, but experienced in the brutal school of 9th-century Frankish border warfare. He is physically imposing. Abbo describes him in terms that are clearly elevated by admiration, but that consistently emphasize his height, his strength, and his endurance. He is also, and this will matter enormously, politically ambitious. He comes from a family that has been building toward the highest level of Frankish power for a generation. Robert the Strong had been, before his death, one of the most powerful non-royal figures in the kingdom. Odo has grown up understanding that the gap between a great Frankish lord and a Frankish king was potentially bridgeable, if the circumstances were right, if the performance was extraordinary, if the moment of crisis produced the right man, and he seized it. The other central figure in the defense is Bishop Goslin, Gorslinus in the Latin sources, and I want to try to convey just how unusual Goslin's role in the siege is by the standards of 9th-century ecclesiastical life. Bishops in the Carolingian Church were not, as a rule, expected to fight. They were princes of the church, administrators of ecclesiastical estates, participants in the political life of the kingdom, and spiritual leaders of their communities. Some of them, particularly bishops in frontier regions, had been known to lead troops in emergencies. But a bishop directing the physical defense of a city under siege, organizing catapult placement and wall repair and civilian military training, while also maintaining the liturgical and spiritual life of a community under extreme stress. This is something else. Goslin does all of it. Goslin is old, in 885, probably in his mid-60s, which in the 9th century is genuinely elderly. He has been Bishop of Paris for only a few years. He is a member of the high Frankish aristocracy, a great-nephew of Adalhard of Corbie, one of the leading churchman-statesmen of Charlemagne's court, and therefore connected by blood and patronage to the highest levels of the Carolingian world. He understands politics. He understands military logistics. He understands the psychology of crisis leadership. And he understands, with absolute clarity, that the decision he makes in the next hours, whether to open the bridges or to hold them, will determine the fate of everything he is responsible for. In the weeks before the Norse fleet arrives, intelligence reports have been coming in from the lower Seine. Norse scouts and advance elements were visible weeks before the main fleet. Frankish traders and refugees were bringing news of the enormous force assembling. Goslin used every day of warning he had. He directed the raising of the bridge towers, building them higher with timber and stone to give defenders a better angle over attackers below. He organized the construction of defensive machines, trebuchets and mangonels for hurling stones, frames for pouring boiling water and burning pitch. He stockpiled food, not enough, as it turned out, but as much as could be gathered from the surrounding countryside before the Norse controlled it. He organized the civilian population into work gangs for wall repair and supply. He sent repeated messages to Charles the Fat begging for military reinforcements. He prayed. And then he waited. November 25th, 885. The feast day of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the early Christian martyr whose story, defiant wisdom in the face of overwhelming pagan power, will seem, in retrospect, a grimly appropriate patron for the day. The Seine mist is heavy in the morning, as it tends to be in late November, sitting on the water in dense white banks that muffle sound and limit visibility. The garrison is at their posts. The civilians are behind walls. Goslin is in the cathedral, in the middle of the morning office. And then the noise begins. Before the fleet is visible, the sound reaches the city, a deep, complex rumble of water and wood and human voices, and the creak of 1,000 pieces of rigging, a sound unlike anything the people on the island have ever heard. Then, as the mist shifts and thins, the ships emerge. Abbo says the river disappeared, that the eye, trying to find water between the ships, could not find it, that from the bridge towers the Norse fleet stretched back around the river bend and out of sight, so that the end of it was simply not visible. Siegfried brought the fleet to a halt before the bridges. Protocol even between enemies, even in an era of extraordinary violence, medieval warfare operated within certain understood conventions, required that he offer terms before attacking. He sent a delegation to the bridge towers under a parley flag. The message they carried was, in its logic, entirely rational. Siegfried was not here to destroy Paris. He had no interest in the destruction of Paris. He simply required passage upriver, open the bridges, stand aside, let the fleet through. The city would not be harmed, the civilians would not be touched. No burning, no pillaging, no killing. Simply, open the bridges. Goslin received the delegation. What happened next is one of those moments that history hinges on, that you can turn over in your hands and examine from every angle and still find extraordinary. An old man, a bishop, a scholar and a politician stood on a tower above the river and looked at the representatives of 30,000 warriors below him and said no. He said Abbo's Latin renders it in elevated oratorical form, but the meaning is clear, that he had been entrusted with this city by God and by his king, that he had not been given Paris to surrender it, that if Siegfried wanted to pass the bridges of Paris, he would have to take them, and that Siegfried's envoys should leave now because the bishop was a busy man. Let's be honest about what that no meant. Goslin knew what the fleet looked like. He could see it from the tower. He knew his garrison numbered fewer than 200 trained fighters. He knew there was no relief force coming, not yet, perhaps not ever. He knew what happened to cities that the Norse took by storm. He knew all of this, and he said no anyway. That is not the behavior of a man who has done a rational calculation and arrived at an optimistic conclusion. That is the behavior of a man who has looked at the numbers and decided that the numbers are not the point. The morning of November 26th, the assault began. Siegfried's forces came in 3 coordinated groups. A direct assault along the bridges themselves, pressing toward the bridge towers from the bank-end approaches. An assault by boat targeting the foundations and lower walls of the towers from the river. And a third group attempting to use grappling hooks and scaling ladders on the outer walls of the island itself. This was not a mob attack. It was a coordinated, multi-axis assault designed to overwhelm the defenders at multiple points simultaneously and prevent them from concentrating their forces to hold any single position the defenders held. For the entire first day of battle, and this matters because the Norse were at their peak on day 1, fresh and motivated and pressing with everything they had, neither tower fell. Abbo's description of the fighting on the Grand Pont Tower is the most detailed passage in his poem, and even allowing for his poetic elevation and his clear admiration for Odo, there is an underlying reality here that the specifics support. Odo fighting in the tower with a war hammer and then a sword. Men pouring burning pitch down the stairwell of the tower when Norse warriors tried to force the door. Stones hurled down from the parapet onto the boats below. The tower foundation shaking with the repeated impact of a Norse battering ram on the door. Abbo gives us one extraordinary detail from the first day's fighting that I want to dwell on. At some point during the morning assault, A group of Norse warriors managed to get a large boat under the tower of the Grand Pont and were attempting to use it as a platform for a scaling assault. Men with ladders and grappling hooks trying to reach the lower windows of the tower from the boat below. Odo, or someone on his orders, had prepared for exactly this. A quantity of burning material, pitch, oil-soaked wood, tow, was poured directly down onto the boat. The boat caught fire. The men on it either jumped into the river or burned. The burning boat, caught by the current and the press of other vessels, lodged against one of the bridge pilings and burned there for some time, physically blocking the river approach to the tower and giving the defenders on that side a brief respite. By nightfall, Siegfried pulled his forces back. He had not taken the towers. He had lost significant men. Abbo's numbers are certainly exaggerated, but the losses were real and at least one large vessel destroyed. The defenders had held the first day. Paris was alive on the morning of November 27th. It was the first of many mornings it should not have survived after the failure of the initial assault. Siegfried made his strategic decision. He would commit to a full siege. This choice deserves more analysis than it usually gets, because it is not obviously the right choice from a Norse strategic perspective. The Norse model of warfare, developed over decades of Frankish raiding, was fundamentally based on mobility and rapid exploitation of opportunity. You strike fast, you take what you can carry, you go before a response force can catch you. A fixed siege, weeks or months in one location, with a large force to feed and supply and keep occupied, is the opposite of that model. It is expensive, logistically demanding, and exposes the attacking force to disease, desertion, and the kind of political fracturing that happens when thousands of independent-minded warriors sit in a camp, doing nothing for an extended period. Siegfried clearly judged that the prize was worth the cost. The bridges of Paris gave access to the wealthiest region of the Frankish kingdom. If he could get past those bridges, the rewards upriver, the monasteries of Burgundy, the royal estates, the merchant towns, would more than compensate for the time and cost of the siege. He was making a long-term investment calculation. He was also, perhaps, betting that the Frankish political system was too dysfunctional to produce an effective relief force in any reasonable timeframe. Given the evidence of the preceding 4 decades, this was not an unreasonable bet. The Norse established their main camp on the north bank of the Seine, almost certainly in the area near what is now the Place du Châtelet, the natural landing point for the north bank approach to the Grand Pont. Abbo describes the camp as fortified, earthwork ramparts, palisades, a system of defensive works that made it a military installation rather than simply an encampment. Around this main camp, a network of secondary positions spread along both banks, controlling the river and the roads that led to the city. The logistical demands of feeding 30,000 men in a siege camp were enormous. The Norse could not supply this force from home. The distances were too great, the ships too few for continuous resupply runs. They were dependent on foraging, stripping the countryside around Paris of food, livestock, stored grain, anything that could be eaten or sold. This foraging was systematic and thorough. Frankish sources describe the depopulation of the Seine Valley for miles in every direction from Paris. Farmsteads abandoned, villages burned, churches stripped. The landscape around the siege camp was, within weeks, essentially a desert inside Paris. The food situation was a constant, grinding anxiety. The city had been supplied before the Norse arrived. Goslin had managed that, but no supply could last indefinitely against the consumption of a city under siege, with no possibility of resupply by river and only the desperate chance of small parties slipping through the Norse lines by night to forage in the surrounding countryside. As the siege extended into December, then into January, the food rations were cut, then cut again. By midwinter, the defenders were probably surviving on quantities of food that modern nutritionists would classify as starvation rations. Starvation is not simply a matter of being hungry. In the medical reality of a 9th century siege, inadequate nutrition compromises the immune system, weakens the muscles, impairs the judgment, and makes the body vulnerable to the infectious diseases that thrive in crowded, unsanitary conditions. A city under siege in winter is also a city with inadequate sanitation. The normal mechanisms for waste disposal break down, water sources become contaminated, the bodies of the dead accumulate faster than they can be buried. Disease likely killed as many people inside Paris during the siege as the Norse attacks did. Abbo describes the daily rhythm of the siege with harrowing specificity. The Norse maintained a near-constant pressure on the defenses, not always full assaults, but regular probing attacks, sustained archery, attempts to breach specific sections of the wall at night. The defenders never had a full night's rest. Every morning the question was, where will they hit today? What section of the wall showed weakness yesterday? What approach had the Norse scouts been studying? The psychological strain of this kind of sustained, unpredictable threat is, from what we know of modern siege psychology and prisoner of war experiences, as destructive as the physical danger itself. February 886. The Seine, swollen by winter rainfall and snowmelt from the Burgundian highlands, rose dramatically. This happened periodically in the medieval Seine. The river's flood behavior before the modern regulation of its upper tributaries was considerably more extreme than it is today. The rising water undermined the foundations of one of the bridge tower sections on the Grand Pont. On the night of February 6th, that section collapsed into the river with a crash that Abbo says could be heard across the city. 12 men were garrisoning that tower section. When dawn came, they were cut off, the bridge partially collapsed, the island unreachable, the river on 3 sides, and the Norse camp 50 meters away on the north bank. Siegfried saw the opportunity immediately and threw a major assault force at the isolated tower. What followed is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire siege. 12 men cut off, with no possibility of resupply or reinforcement, held that ruined tower for an entire day against the concentrated assault of thousands. Abbo records their names. Every single name. Abbo was a poet and understood what the moment demanded, which was the permanent record of what those men did. He gives us their places of origin, the manner of their individual deaths, the weapons they used, the spirit in which they faced the end. He says the Norse were so astonished by the resistance that they offered the survivors honorable terms of surrender, their lives in exchange for the tower. The survivors apparently refused. They preferred to die fighting. They died fighting, all 12. I have spent a long time with this passage. I have read it in the original Latin and in translation. And what strikes me every time is not the heroism, or not only the heroism, but the choice. These men knew exactly what refusing the Norse offer meant. They were not refusing out of ignorance. They were not refusing because they thought relief was coming. They refused because surrender, to them, was worse than death in the specific spiritual and cultural framework in which they lived and understood their existence. That framework is medieval. It is Christian in a very specific 9th century way, and it is genuinely foreign to most of us today. But the courage it produced was real, and it deserves to be named and remembered, which is exactly what Abbo did, and which is exactly what I am trying to do now. The loss of that tower section forced a tactical reorganization of the defense. The Grand Pont was now unusable as a defended crossing. The damaged section could not hold the weight of defenders, and rebuilding under siege conditions was not possible. The Norse shifted their primary pressure to the Petit Pont on the south bank and to direct assault against the island's outer walls from boats on the river. Paris had lost one of its two main defensive anchors. The situation was now genuinely critical at some point in early 886. The precise date is not recoverable from the sources. Odo made a decision that must have seemed, to anyone looking at it from outside, borderline suicidal. He decided to leave Paris and go to Charles the Fat in person. Not to abandon the city, I want to be clear about this, because the interpretation of Odo's departure as a desertion has been advanced by some historians, and I think the evidence, properly read, tells a different story. Rather, Odo concluded that the messengers he had been sending to the king were not producing results. Charles the Fat was not moving. The standard channels of royal communication had failed. Someone with authority and credibility needed to stand in front of the king and make the situation viscerally real. Odo decided that someone was him. The problem was that getting out of Paris was not trivial. The Norse controlled the river and both banks. The bridges were not usable for exit, even if the Grand Pont had been intact. Walking across it toward the Norse camp was not an option. Odo chose the direct method. He assembled a small escort of mounted knights, probably his household guard, the most experienced fighters he had, and they rode at the Norse perimeter on the north bank at speed. It was, in the language of modern military tactics, a breakthrough by force, hitting a specific point in the enemy line with concentrated momentum, accepting casualties, and getting enough men through the gap to continue moving before the enemy could close it. Abbo's description of the breakout is the most kinetic passage in the poem. Odo on horseback, his lance leveled, the Norse line ahead of him in the grey morning light. The crash of impact, the scatter of men on foot before cavalry, the lance breaking, the sword drawn. Norse warriors grabbing at the horses, being cut down or knocked aside. Odo through the first line, his escort around him, moving fast, moving east, moving away from the camp. Norse horsemen, yes, the Norse did use cavalry, less than the Franks, but never in pursuit. The pursuit falling behind. Open countryside, freedom, the terrible specific freedom of a man who has just escaped from a place where everyone he cares about is still trapped. Abbo says Odo turned and looked back at the city from a distance and wept. I believe this, not because Abbo is infallible, he is not, but because the emotional logic is exact. He had held Paris for months. He had watched men die. He had made every decision he could make from inside the walls. And now he was outside, intact, alive, with the city behind him still under siege and no certainty that it would be there when he returned. That weeping is the weeping of a man who has been holding himself together by sheer will and has now, for the first time in months, a moment to feel what he has been suppressing in order to function in the city he left behind. The defense continued under Goslin and the remaining officers. But his absence was felt. Odo's physical presence, that large, competent, visibly unafraid body on the parapet of the Grand Pont, had been a significant element of the garrison's morale. Without him, without the immediate prospect of relief, with food running short and the Grand Pont tower gone and the Norse pressure unrelenting, the defenders were operating in a space that was becoming psychologically as well as physically untenable. It was in this period that Goslin began to negotiate more seriously with Siegfried, and here we need to be careful about what negotiate meant in this context. Goslin was not negotiating surrender. He was not offering to open the bridges. He was engaging in the kind of sustained diplomatic dialogue that medieval commanders on both sides understood as both protocol and strategy, a series of conversations that acknowledged each side's position, that communicated intentions and constraints, and that crucially bought time. Every day that Goslin kept Siegfried talking was a day that Charles the Fat's army might be one day closer to arriving. Every concession offered and refused was a test of each side's resolve. The negotiation was not an alternative to the fight, it was part of the fight. In late March or early April of 886, again, the exact date is not recoverable, Bishop Goslin died. He had been ill for some time. Abbo's account makes clear that the illness was progressive, not sudden, a slow decline that Goslin refused to acknowledge or accommodate until it became impossible to ignore. He kept working through it. He kept appearing on the walls. He kept conducting the liturgy. He kept receiving Siegfried's envoys and sending them away with the same answer. He kept doing everything the defense required of him, and his body kept being eroded by the siege that his will refused to accept. What killed him was almost certainly a combination of factors. The cold and damp of a winter in an unheated medieval city, the inadequate nutrition of siege rations, the physical exhaustion of months of sustained crisis management at an age when most men were long past active military service, and almost certainly some specific infectious illness that his compromised immune system could not fight. He was old and he had spent himself completely, and there was nothing left to keep him alive. Abbo's account of Goslin's final days is the most formally elegiac section of the poem, and it shows Abbo at his most accomplished as a writer. He describes a man diminishing physically while remaining entirely present intellectually and spiritually. A bishop who is visibly dying, but who uses every remaining hour of consciousness for the city's benefit. Goslin continues to receive reports on the Norse positions and the condition of the defenses from his sickbed. He continues to issue orders. He celebrates Mass, Abbo says. On the last morning, he is well enough to stand. The scene Abbo describes of Goslin's death has the quality of a medieval painting. The old bishop lying on the stone floor of the cathedral, the candles burning, the garrison gathered around him, his final words to the men who had fought with him for nearly 5 months. He tells them that the city will hold. He tells them that God's protection has been real through every assault, every hardship. Every morning they woke up, and the walls were still standing. He tells them that every man who has died in this defense has died worthily. And then he dies. The stone floor detail. Abbo specifically notes that Goslin chose to die on the floor rather than in a bed, is the kind of specific, concrete detail that tends to survive in historical memory because it is visually and emotionally arresting. Whether it is literally true, I cannot say, but as a summation of a character, of a man who chose the posture of humility and service over the comfort and status his rank entitled him to, it is perfect. Goslin died as he had lived during the siege, giving everything he had, keeping nothing back. His death was a crisis for the defense, but not in the way you might expect. Not because the military capacity of the garrison collapsed without him, but because he had been the spiritual anchor of the city. In a 9th-century community facing existential threat, the bishop was not simply an administrator. He was the representative of divine authority, the person whose faith made God's protection manifest and credible. Goslin's certainty that God would protect Paris had been a concrete resource for the defenders, a source of resolve that functioned as surely as food or weapons. When Goslin died, that certainty needed to be rebuilt from scratch by people who were much more tired and much less certain than he had been while Paris starved and fought and buried its bishop. Charles the Fat was doing what Charles the Fat did in this period, moving slowly, reacting to immediate political pressures, failing to take decisive action on any front. The historical literature on Charles III is uniformly unflattering, and while I want to approach him with some fairness, he was dealing with multiple crises. He was evidently unwell. The structural problems of the Carolingian system were not his creation. The record is difficult to defend. Charles had received news of the Norse siege of Paris by December 885 at the latest. The situation was described with sufficient clarity in the messages sent by Goslin and Odo that the urgency should have been obvious. Paris was one of the most symbolically important cities in the Frankish kingdom, the site of the royal palace, the seat of the bishop, the place that represented, more than any other, the continuity of the Carolingian order in the Western Kingdom. Its fall would have been not merely a military disaster, but a catastrophe for the prestige of the dynasty. Charles spent the winter of 885–886 in Germany and Italy. His court moved from one royal palace to another in the customary way of Carolingian kingship, which did not have a fixed capital. He dealt with other political business. The records show councils, assemblies, grants of land and privilege, the ordinary bureaucratic business of a medieval king. What they do not show is any urgent marshalling of military forces for a relief expedition to the Seine. The sense one gets from the sources is of a man who understood that Paris was in danger and was not moved to act with anything like the speed the situation required. This paralysis has several possible explanations, and they are probably all partially true. Charles was, by multiple contemporary accounts, suffering from some kind of physical or neurological condition. The sources describe episodes of incapacitation, of confused or erratic behavior, of apparent inability to make decisions. Modern historians have speculated about epilepsy, about the effects of a head injury sustained in a riding accident, about any number of conditions that might account for the pattern of behavior the sources describe. He may genuinely have been incapacitated in a medical sense. At crucial moments he was also, almost certainly, afraid. Not necessarily in a simple physical cowardice sense, but in the political sense that a king who assembles an army to fight 30,000 Norse warriors and loses has destroyed his remaining credibility entirely. Charles had very little political capital left by 885. A military defeat would have consumed what remained. The temptation to delay, to seek a diplomatic solution, to find some way to make the problem go away without the catastrophic risk of a pitched battle. That temptation must have been enormous. Whatever the reasons for the delay, Charles finally assembled an army and moved toward the Seine in the summer of 886. He arrived with his forces on the heights above the river. Some accounts say he could see the city from his camp, could see the Norse fleet still on the river, could see the smoke from Norse cooking fires on the north bank. He camped there. And then he negotiated. What Charles negotiated was this: 700 pounds of silver in tribute. Note that this is exactly 100 pounds more than the ransom paid by Charles the Bald in 845, which suggests that either there was an established price list for this kind of transaction, or that the two figures are independently plausible and it is a coincidence. In exchange for the Norse agreeing to lift the siege of Paris and redirect their operations upriver into Burgundy, where a rebellion against Charles's authority was in progress, the Norse would be paid to leave Paris alone. They would then be paid, implicitly in the proceeds of their raiding in Burgundy, to serve as an instrument of royal vengeance against the king's own rebellious subjects. This deal is, by any standard, extraordinary in its cynicism. Charles had arrived with enough force. The sources suggest his army was substantial to at least contest control of the Seine Valley with the Norse. He chose not to fight. He chose instead to turn the instrument of his kingdom's suffering against his own subjects, in exchange for silver. The people of Paris, who had held the city for 11 months in the expectation that their king would come and save them, watched the Norse fleet sail past their walls upriver with the king's permission, and the king's silver in their holds. Abbo's description of the moment Paris understood what had happened is, as I mentioned earlier, remarkable for its controlled fury. He does not use the word betrayal. He does not have to. He simply describes the watching and the silence and the ships going past. The silence in that passage is the loudest thing in the entire poem. Charles the Fat was deposed at the Assembly of Tribur in November 887, less than 15 months after his deal on the Seine. The immediate cause was a political rebellion by his nephew Arnulf of Carinthia, but the deeper cause was the accumulated delegitimization of a man who had failed his people visibly, publicly, and repeatedly. The Siege of Paris was only the most dramatic of his failures, but it was the most symbolically resonant. The moment when the gap between what a Carolingian king was supposed to be and what Charles actually was became too wide to paper over with political convention. He died in January 888, deposed, powerless, attended only by a small retinue. He was 55 years old. The Norse spent the winter of 886–887 in Burgundy, raiding as permitted. They returned down the Seine in spring 887, collected their silver, and sailed for the sea. The siege of Paris was over. The city had not fallen, but the world around it had been transformed. In February 888, the nobles of the West Frankish kingdom met to choose a new king. The Carolingian claimant available was the young Charles, the simple Charles III, who was genuinely simple in the sense of being straightforward and honest rather than mentally deficient, despite what the nickname suggests. He was in his early teens, untested, untried, and backed by the prestige of the Carolingian name. The alternative was Odo of Paris, the man who had held the city, the man who had fought on the Grand Pont Tower, the man who had broken through Norse lines on horseback and wept looking back at his city. The nobles of France chose Odo. This election is historically seismic, and I want to make sure the seismicity registers properly. The Carolingian dynasty had ruled the Frankish kingdom in various configurations for over a century. The principle that legitimate kingship derived from Carolingian blood had been, for most of that time, essentially unquestioned. Individual Carolingians had been deposed, assassinated, forced into monasteries, but they had been replaced by other Carolingians. The bloodline itself had never been set aside. Odo's election as king broke that principle for the first time. It established, for the first time in the history of the Frankish kingdom, that a man who was not of the blood could claim and receive the crown on the basis of merit, of demonstrated service, of having, in the plainest possible terms, earned it. The principle once established does not disappear. Odo's family, the Robertians, later called the Capetians, would eventually displace the Carolingians permanently and found the dynasty that would rule France for over 300 years in direct succession and centuries more in cadet branches. The last Capetian king of France in the direct line died in 1328. The last monarch of France in a Capetian cadet branch, the Bourbon Louis Philippe, was deposed in 1848. From Odo, elected in 888 on the strength of his defense of Paris, to the end of the French monarchy in 1848, nearly 1,000 years. That is the arc that begins on the bridge towers of the Seine. The Norse trajectory from the siege is equally consequential, if less immediately dramatic. The force that had besieged Paris for 11 months did not simply disperse after collecting their silver. The Seine Valley had, over the decades of Norse activity, become something of a Norse homeland in the making. Norse leaders had established semi-permanent bases in the lower Seine. Norse settlers had intermarried with the local Frankish population. The infrastructure of a Norse community in the Seine Valley existed, even if it lacked formal political recognition. In 911, Charles the Simple, who eventually did become King of the West Franks, as a young Carolingian recovery of sorts, negotiated the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with the Norse leader Rollo. By the terms of this treaty, Rollo and his followers received the Seine Valley and its surrounding territories as a fief, in exchange for converting to Christianity, swearing fealty to the Frankish crown, and defending the Seine mouth against further Norse incursions. The territory became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and its new lord became the first Duke of Normandy. Rollo was almost certainly present during or connected to the Norse force that besieged Paris in 885–886. The man who, in 911, became the founding ancestor of the Norman Duchy, and through it, ancestor of William the Conqueror, and therefore ancestor of the entire Norman dynasty that would conquer England in 1066 and reshape the Mediterranean world through the Norman kingdoms of Sicily and Antioch, may well have stood on the north bank of the Seine outside Paris 25 years before Normandy existed and watched Goslin's defiance from across the water. The line from that moment of defiance to the Doomsday Book, to the Tower of London, to the development of Anglo-Norman culture and the English legal system, and the development of the English language itself. That line runs through Paris 885, through Normandy 911, through Hastings 1066, and into the world we inhabit now. Every major historical event has an afterlife in memory and interpretation, and the Siege of Paris has had a particularly rich and contested one. Let's trace that afterlife, because understanding how the siege has been remembered and misremembered tells us something important about how history works and what it is for. In the immediate aftermath, the primary vehicle for memory was Abbo's poem. The Bella Parisiacae Urbis was composed sometime in the 890s, probably around 897, based on internal evidence, and circulated widely through the Frankish monastic network. It was read and copied in monasteries across France and Germany. It was used as a teaching text for the study of Latin rhetoric and composition. It shaped the terms in which educated Franks thought about the siege for the next several centuries. And because Abbo was present, because his account has the vividness of eyewitness testimony filtered through genuine literary skill, his version of events became the version. Abbo's version is, as I have said, shaped by his agenda. He is writing a poem about faith and divine protection and the proper behavior of Christian leaders in crisis. His Goslin is a saint in waiting, his Odo a secular hero, his Charles the Fat a negative exemplum, his Norse attackers both terrifying and strangely admirable in their ferocity. He is not writing objective history, but the framework he constructs, the siege as a moral and spiritual test, passed by the defenders and failed by the king, was enormously influential on how subsequent generations thought about it. In the 19th century, the siege acquired new significance as French national history became a major intellectual and political project. The decades after the Revolution, after Napoleon, after the humiliation of 1870, produced an intense investment in the medieval origins of French national identity. Historians and popularizers seized on the Siege of Paris as a foundational moment, the first great act of French national resistance, the birth of French defiance. In this reading, Goslin and Odo became proto-national heroes, and Charles the Fat became a symbol of the political failures that France needed to repudiate the problem with this reading, and it is a serious one, is that it projects onto the 9th century a set of concepts that simply did not exist then. France as a national identity, as a thing people identified with and fought for, is a product of much later centuries. The people defending Paris in 885 were not defending France. They were defending Paris, their church, their community, their lives. The Norse attacking them were not attacking France as a civilizational enemy. They were pursuing economic and strategic objectives in a political landscape they understood in Norse terms. Applying the nationalist lens to this event distorts it beyond recognition what the siege actually was. Stripped of both medieval religious framing and modern nationalist projection, was a crucial episode in the structural transformation of Western Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. The transition from the Carolingian imperial model to the decentralized, castle and county feudalism that would characterize medieval Europe for the next 3 centuries. The siege both reflected and accelerated that transformation. It reflected it because the inability to relieve Paris was a symptom of the Carolingian system's collapse. It accelerated it because the political consequences, the deposition of Charles the Fat, the election of Odo, pushed the West Frankish kingdom decisively away from the imperial model and toward the regional lord model that the Robertians/Capetians would institutionalize. I want to take a brief turn toward the physical evidence, because archaeology has both confirmed and usefully complicated the written sources in ways that matter for how we understand the siege. The primary challenge for archaeologists working on 9th century Paris is the obvious one. The city has been continuously occupied, rebuilt, demolished, and rebuilt again for over 2,000 years. The Isle de la Cité is now covered by the Cathedral of Notre Dame, by the Palais de Justice, by centuries of medieval, early modern, and modern construction that has effectively buried the Carolingian city under meters of subsequent occupation. Systematic archaeological investigation has only been possible in specific windows, during major construction projects, during restoration work, and in a few areas where Carolingian-era deposits are preserved relatively near the surface. The most significant 20th century excavation was conducted under the Parvis, the forecourt of Notre Dame, in the 1960s, when the underground car park now beneath the square was being constructed. These excavations revealed a complete stratigraphic sequence from the Roman period through the medieval, and included clear evidence of Carolingian-era construction on the island. Building foundations, drainage channels, material culture consistent with 9th century occupation, and importantly, evidence of burning in the appropriate stratigraphic layer, burning consistent with the Norse attacks on the suburbs of Paris, and potentially with the siege itself near the sites of the medieval bridge towers. Investigations have produced structural remains that are consistent with the kind of fortified bridge construction that Abbo describes: substantial stone foundation elements, evidence of multiple phases of construction and repair, and burn layers that might represent either Norse attack or the defenders' use of fire as a weapon. The interpretation of these remains is not always unambiguous, but the cumulative picture is consistent with the historical account. Norse material culture from the Seine is harder to find in context, but not absent. Decades of river dredging and occasional underwater survey have produced a collection of Norse-era metalwork from the Paris reach of the Seine. Axe heads, sword fragments, spear points, shield bosses, strap ends, and occasional pieces of personal equipment. None of these can be definitively attributed to the 885–886 siege, as opposed to other periods of Norse activity on the Seine. But collectively, they document a sustained Norse military presence in the river that the written sources predict. There is one aspect of the physical record that I find particularly evocative. The monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where Abbo lived and from where he watched the siege, still stands, or rather, a substantially rebuilt version of it still stands in the 6th arrondissement. The core of the medieval church survives in the tower and the nave. Standing in the square of Saint-Germain-des-Prés on a November morning and looking north toward the Seine, which is only a few hundred meters away, you are looking along approximately the same sightline that Abbo used 11 centuries ago to watch the Norse fleet and the burning towers and the city that should have fallen and didn't. There is something that no amount of historiographical sophistication entirely eliminates from that experience. The river is still there. The light on it in November is still the same grey-silver light that Abbo described. The distances are still the same. And if you stand there long enough, with enough of this story in your head, you can feel, not intellectually understand, but physically feel the weight of what happened here. I want to return to the individual human beings at the heart of this story, because one of the things that makes the Siege of Paris so compelling as a historical episode is the unusual vividness with which the principal characters emerge from the sources. Medieval history is often a history of institutions and processes in which individual human beings function as types and symbols rather than as people. The siege breaks through that pattern in places, giving us moments of genuine psychological specificity that feel, across 11 centuries, startlingly immediate. Let's start with Siegfried, because Siegfried is the figure we understand least and who is most interesting precisely because of that opacity. Everything we know about him comes through the filter of Frankish sources, Abbo primarily, and those sources have no interest in portraying him sympathetically. He is the adversary. He is the force that besieges. He is, in Abbo's moral framework, something close to a divine instrument of punishment. And yet, even through that distorting lens, a specific personality emerges. Siegfried was patient in a way that is genuinely unusual for a Norse leader in this period. The logic of Norse raiding militates against patience. You go fast, you hit hard, you take what you can get and leave. A year-long siege is the opposite of that logic, maintaining the cohesion and motivation of a force of 30,000 men in a fixed camp for 11 months, when those men are individually driven by the pursuit of profit and personal glory and have no ideological commitment to abstract strategic objectives. That is a leadership achievement of the first order. Siegfried managed it. He kept his force together, kept them fighting, kept them invested in the objective for 11 months. That is not luck. That is exceptional personal authority. He was also flexible in his thinking. When direct assault failed, he tried sustained investment. When investment was taking longer than expected, he opened negotiations, not as a sign of weakness, but as a parallel track, keeping the diplomatic option alive while continuing military pressure. When Charles the Fat arrived with an army, Siegfried read the situation correctly. The king was not going to fight. There was a deal available. He took it. The ability to shift between military and diplomatic modes without losing coherence, to be genuinely threatening and genuinely negotiable at the same time, is a sophisticated operational skill that many commanders never develop. Goslin I have already discussed at length, but there is one dimension of his character that I want to add, which is his relationship to doubt. Abbo presents him as certain that God would protect Paris, certain that the right course was resistance, certain in his faith and his judgment. And I think that certainty was real, in the sense that it was genuine and consistently maintained. But I also think that genuine certainty of the kind Goslin displayed is not the absence of doubt. It is the discipline to act despite doubt, to keep performing confidence, because the alternative, letting the people around you see your fear, would cost more than the performance of certainty does. Goslin was old and ill and knew it. He was directing the defense of a city against impossible odds and knew it. His certainty was not the certainty of ignorance. It was the certainty of a man who had looked at the alternatives and decided that this was the only one worth choosing. Odo is the most complex figure in the story, because Odo is the one who survived and who built a dynasty from what he survived. His ambition is real and documented. The Robertian family had been working toward the crown for a generation before 885. His courage is equally real and documented. You don't break through a Norse perimeter on horseback by performing bravery. You do it by being brave. The question that interests me about Odo is not whether he was brave or whether he was ambitious. He was both. But whether, in the specific moment of the siege, those two things can be distinguished. Was he defending Paris for Paris, or was he defending Paris for the career it would build? I don't think that's the right question. I think the more honest answer is that he was defending Paris, and the career was a consequence. He was intelligent enough to understand and honest enough not to pretend was irrelevant. And then there are the unnamed, the civilians who repaired the walls at night, the women who organized food distribution, the children who carried messages, the monks of the island's monasteries who kept the liturgy going through the assaults and the hunger and the cold. Abbo mentions them occasionally, collectively, as a chorus to the named heroes. But without them, the named heroes could not have done what they did. A siege is not won by commanders and champions, however valiant. A siege is won by the aggregate endurance of everyone inside the walls, each person choosing, day after day, not to give up. The unnamed defenders of Paris made that choice 11 months in a row. They deserve to be remembered too. What if Paris had fallen? I know historians are not supposed to play this game. Counterfactual history is, in the eyes of many professional historians, somewhere between a parlor game and an intellectual vice. But I want to argue that the right kind of counterfactual thinking is not just entertainment. It is a tool for understanding what was actually at stake in a historical moment. When we ask, what if Paris had fallen in November 885, we are asking, what was the actual weight of the choice Goslin made when he refused to open the bridges? Let's try to think through the most immediate consequences. If the bridge towers fall on day one, if Goslin opens the bridges, or if the assault succeeds before the defense can organize, Siegfried gets passage upriver. His fleet moves into Burgundy and beyond. The rich interior of the Frankish kingdom, which had been defended by Paris's geography, is now open. The monastery of Vézelay, the royal estates of Burgundy, the merchant towns of the Rhone corridor, all accessible. The raid proceeds on a scale and with a depth of penetration that no Norse operation in the Frankish kingdom had previously achieved. Meanwhile, in Paris itself, the sack. The Norse sack of Paris in 845 gave us a template, systematically stripping the city of portable wealth, the cathedral treasury, the palace, the monastic libraries with their illuminated manuscripts, gold and jewels on the covers, vellum worth money, the private wealth of the clergy and the merchant class, burning what couldn't be taken, enslaving who couldn't escape. The population of Paris, however we estimate it, is probably reduced by half in the week following the fall of the city. Politically, the immediate consequence for Charles the Fat is catastrophic. Paris fallen means the Carolingian dynasty has lost its most symbolically important possession without a fight. The assembly of Triber happens earlier, probably in the winter of 800, and 85–886, rather than the autumn of 887. Charles is deposed faster and with less ceremony. The Carolingian recovery of the late 880s and 890s, the brief resurgence under Arnulf of Carinthia in the east, and the eventual restoration of Charles the Simple in the west, may or may not happen, depending on how completely the events of 885–886 shatter Carolingian credibility. The Robertian/Capetian rise is the interesting uncertainty. Odo's claim to the crown rested on the defense of Paris. Without that defense, he is simply another Frankish count, capable, well-connected, but without the specific demonstration of royal virtue that made his election in 888 possible. The Capetian dynasty, founded on Paris's survival, might never come to be. The West Frankish kingdom might fragment more completely into regional powers, each one aligned with local Norse strongmen in the way that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England were, in this same period, being reshaped by Danish settlement and then Normandy. The Treaty of Saint-Germain in 911 was possible because Rollo had a specific, defined territory, the lower Seine Valley, that had been a Norse operating zone for decades, and that the Frankish crown had already effectively lost control of. Granting it formally to Rollo was acknowledging a reality. But if Norse influence had penetrated much further up the Seine in 885–886, the reality that the 911 treaty acknowledges might be different in shape and extent. Normandy might be larger. It might have a different political character, less Frankified, more distinctly Norse. The specific cultural synthesis that produced Norman military innovation, the combination of Norse ferocity and Frankish feudal organization, the castle-building tradition, the cavalry tactics, might develop differently or not at all. No Hastings in 1066. Possibly no Norman dynasty in England. Possibly no development of English common law under Henry II, who was a Plantagenet, but whose legal reforms built on the Norman foundation. Possibly no Magna Carta. The chain gets very long and very speculative very quickly, and I am not going to claim that a single decision on a bridge in 885 determined the outcome of 1066. History doesn't work in single chains, but what I will claim is that the specific combination of conditions that made 1066 possible, the Norman Duchy, its culture, its military capacity, its specific political relationship with England, was dependent on Normandy developing in the specific way it did. And Normandy's development depended on the conditions established by the Norse settlement of the Seine Valley. And those conditions were shaped, partly but meaningfully, by what happened at the bridges of Paris. I owe you an honest accounting of the sources and the scholarly debates, because this has been a long video, and you have invested significant time in it, and you deserve to know the difference between what I am confident about and what I am interpreting, and what I am interpreting and what I am speculating. Our primary source is Abbo of Saint-Germain's Bella Parisiacae Urbis. This is the foundation of everything we know about the siege in detail. It is invaluable and it is flawed. It is invaluable because Abbo was there, a young monk in the monastery across the river, close enough to see much of what he describes, in a community that would have been receiving reports and refugees from the city throughout the siege. His knowledge of specific incidents, specific persons, specific tactical details is the kind that comes from proximity. The poem is also, however, a poem, a highly stylized literary composition in the elevated Latin mode, shaped by rhetorical convention, theological agenda, and political context. Numbers should be treated skeptically. Speeches are reconstructed or invented. The moral framework, God protecting the faithful, punishing the faithless, shapes the selection and presentation of events throughout. Secondary sources in the near-contemporary period include the Annals Vedastini, the Annals of Saint Vast, a monastery near Arras, which provides a more laconic, analytic account of the siege and its aftermath from a somewhat different political perspective. Regino of Prum's Chronicon, written in the early 10th century, provides useful context for the political situation. Various royal charters and diplomas from the period, while not directly discussing the siege, provide circumstantial evidence about political conditions. The modern scholarly literature on the siege is substantial. I have drawn most heavily on Simon Coupland's meticulous work on Frankish responses to Viking activity, which provides the essential economic and military context. Janet Nelson's work on the Carolingian world, particularly her biography of Charles the Bald and her broader essays on 9th-century Frankish politics, is essential for the political background. Neil Price's recent synthesis of Norse cultural history has transformed our understanding of what the Norse world actually looked like from the inside, in ways that earlier scholarship, based primarily on later saga sources, had systematically distorted. For the archaeology of Carolingian Paris, I have relied primarily on Mitchell Fleury's work and the reports from the Notre Dame forecourt excavations. Areas of genuine scholarly disagreement include the size of the Norse force. I have used the traditional figure of 700 ships and 30,000 men, but these are almost certainly exaggerated, and the real numbers were probably lower by a significant factor, while still representing the largest Norse expedition in the Frankish kingdom in the 9th century. The precise chronology of events within the siege is also contested, as the dating in Abbo is not consistent with other sources in every detail. The identity of Siegfried remains uncertain, and the relationship between the various Norse leaders mentioned in the siege accounts, Siegfried, Sinric, others, is not fully clear. And the question of exactly how many people were inside Paris, and therefore how desperate the food situation was, is genuinely unanswerable with current evidence. I have tried throughout this video to present my interpretation as interpretation, and to be clear when I am speculating rather than reporting. The emotional reconstructions, Goslin on the stone floor, Odo weeping as he looks back at the city, are my interpretations of Abbo's descriptions, not direct transcriptions of events. The characterizations of the principal figures draw on evidence, but inevitably involve inference and imagination. Good history, I believe, requires both honesty about uncertainty and the willingness to make interpretive judgments, because without the latter, the past remains an assemblage of disconnected facts rather than a story about people and choices. I have tried to make that judgment clearly, and I have tried not to claim more certainty than the evidence warrants. We have been on the Seine for a long time. We have watched the fleet arrive, and the towers hold, and the bridge collapse, and the bishop die, and the king come too late and make his shameful deal, and the Norse ships go past the walls of the city they could not take. We have followed the threads forward into the political consequences, into the rise of the Capetians, into the world of Normandy and Hastings, and the long downstream of medieval European history. We have been honest about the limits of what we know and what we don't, and now we are at the end. You to take from this, what is the thing, after all this time, that I most want you to carry away from Paris in 885? Is this, that the world is made by specific choices, made by specific people, under specific pressures, in specific moments of crisis. Not by historical forces, not by structural inevitabilities, not by the tide of civilization flowing in its predetermined direction. By people, by Goslin deciding, on a tower above the river that the answer was no. By the 12 men on the collapsed tower deciding that surrender was worse than death. By Odo turning his horse at the Norse perimeter and riding through. By the unnamed civilians who carried stones to the breach in the wall in the middle of the night, who fed their neighbors from dwindling stores, who chose, every single morning, to keep going. Also made by failures. By Charles the Fat sitting in his palace in Germany while messages from Paris accumulated on his desk. By the aristocrats who had been too focused on their own power, struggles to build the kind of coordinated frontier defense that might have made the siege unnecessary. By 40 years of paying Danegeld that taught the Norse a lesson it took a full year of Paris to begin to unteach. The failures matter as much as the heroism. They are part of the same story. It is made by ambiguity. By Siegfried, who was an enemy and a professional, a destroyer and a diplomat, a man who made rational calculations about the price of things and who was, in the end, willing to take a deal when a deal was better than a fight. By Odo, who was brave and ambitious and who probably could not have told you in any given moment where one ended and the other began. By the Norse warriors who admired the 12 defenders of the bridge tower enough to offer them terms and were astonished when the terms were refused. The clean moral categories, hero and villain, Christian and pagan, civilization and barbarism, dissolve when you get close enough to see the people inside them. Paris lasted 11 months. When it was over, the city had not fallen, the king had been disgraced, the dynasty that would rule France for 1,000 years was waiting in the wings, and the Viking Age in Western Europe had reached its high-water mark and was beginning, slowly, to recede. The consequences radiated outward in every direction for centuries, and at the center of all of it was a bridge, 2 towers, 200 soldiers, and an old bishop who said no. Who is still echoing. We are living in its echo. It seems worth knowing where it came from. For being here. If this video gave you something, a new perspective, a moment of historical vertigo, a name or story you'll carry with you, please share it with someone who loves history the way you do. It makes more difference than you know. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave a comment, I read them all, and the conversations in the comments section of this channel are genuinely some of the best I have anywhere. And if you want to go deeper on the siege, I've left a reading list in the description below. Primary sources in translation, the essential scholarship, and a few of the archaeological reports. Next time, keep asking why. Keep going deeper. Keep treating the past as what it is, not a collection of safe, distant events, but the record of real people making real choices in real moments of crisis. Their choices made our world. Understanding those choices is how we understand ourselves. Extensive research for this video. It was not possible to cover all the research in the video, but I have provided the links to all the research in the description. You will get complete reference